I waited 42 minutes in the reception lobby of Apex Pinnacle Technologies, not because the executive team forgot I was sitting there, but because they wanted me to feel every single second of the delay. From where I sat on a pale leather armchair, I had a clear view through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the main executive corner office. The glass was polished to a flawless finish, crystal clear enough to reveal everything happening inside, yet thick enough to remind everyone outside that they were excluded. Inside that room, people were smiling and raising espresso cups around a polished mahogany conference table. A man in a tailored dark blue suit shook hands with enthusiasm, while another junior director leaned in with a tablet, smiling like every fraction of a second of attention from the woman at the head of the table was a prize earned after a long battle. Outside in the quiet corridor, I sat alone with an unopened glass bottle of sparkling water resting on the side table. No assistant had offered to refresh the beverage or check on my schedule. No staff member had stopped by to acknowledge that my appointment had been scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. I considered standing up and walking out more than once during that long wait. Not because I lacked the professional patience to wait for a delayed meeting, but because after 32 years in corporate restructuring and institutional capital syndication, I have learned a foundational rule. No self-respecting professional should ever accept being deliberately subjected to calculated humiliation disguised as executive busyness. As two senior vice presidents strolled past the glass panel, one of them glanced sideways at me and murmured softly to his colleague that I was still sitting in the waiting area. His companion barely bothered to look over, casually responding that if I had been waiting this long without complaining, I clearly could not be a person of any real consequence. My name is Gavin Vance. I am 54 years old, and for the past 6 months, I had been working as the lead architect and independent manager of a $500 million capital syndicate. Apex Pinnacle Technologies, a mid-tier enterprise software firm, attempting to launch an aggressive artificial intelligence infrastructure pivot, was currently standing just one signature away from closing that vital transaction. Without that $500 million capital injection, the company was facing an immediate covenant default on its senior credit facilities within 90 days. I did not work for Apex Pinnacle, nor was I an applicant seeking internal employment. I was the neutral fiduciary holding together 3 distinct institutional private equity funds that collectively made up the syndicate framework. Over the past 3 decades, I built my reputation by serving as an independent bridge between cautious institutional lenders and ambitious corporate borrowers. When major financial institutions agree to pool hundreds of millions of dollars into a single corporate vehicle, they rarely trust the borrower's internal management team to oversee the allocation. They require an independent architect who understands risk covenants, asset escrows, and fiduciary governance. That was precisely the role I filled for the $500 million package assembled for Apex Pinnacle. I spent 6 grueling months negotiating terms with 3 major funds, creating a balanced governance structure where no single fund felt exposed to unhedged risk. The financial market in Manhattan is remarkably small at the institutional level. Managing partners of top-tier private equity funds do not make multi-hundred-million-dollar commitments based on slick corporate slide decks alone. They make commitments based on structural safety guarantees verified by trusted independent advisors. Apex Pinnacle had struggled for nearly 2 years to secure refinancing on their maturing senior note facilities. Internal executives had tried pitching to dozens of private equity shops without success because nobody believed the internal financial projections. It was only after my firm intervened, restructured the covenant debt compliance ratios, and instituted an independent escrow framework that Kingsley Financial Group, Price Asset Management, and Stonebridge Equity agreed to sit at the same table. In complex corporate transactions, the syndicate manager functions as the invisible anchor, holding an entire deal upright. If the syndicate manager steps away or is pushed aside, the underlying trust framework instantly disintegrates. The participating funds had agreed to pool their capital under a shared legal framework where my firm held sole authority over disbursement schedules, intellectual property verifications, and compliance milestones. To an outsider who knew nothing about institutional debt architecture, I looked like an external consultant, holding a folder. To the managing partners controlling the funds, I was the only reason $500 million was sitting on the table. The heavy glass door finally swung open with a quiet hiss, and Maya Lawson, the executive assistant, stepped into the waiting lounge holding a leather-bound tablet tightly against her rib cage. Her eyes flicked nervously toward me as she took a hesitant breath. She spoke in a clipped, formal tone, thanking me for my patience. Maya was 28 years old, bright and diligent, but visibly anxious about the intense atmosphere surrounding the new executive suite. Before I could stand up or ask whether we were moving into the main boardroom, the inner office door clicked open again. Chloe Montgomery, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Apex Pinnacle, stepped out into the hallway framed by her ivory blazer and sharp-tailored trousers. She was 39 years old, aggressive and determined to project absolute domain over every square foot of the corporate headquarters. She had been hired by the board 4 weeks earlier to accelerate growth, and she approached her new position with the aggressive swagger of someone who believed that kindness was a sign of weakness, and that executive authority was measured by how harshly one could treat subordinates and vendors. Chloe glanced at me once. It was a brief, dismissive swipe of her eyes that lingered for less than a second, carrying the unmistakable coldness of someone who measures human worth entirely by corporate titles and badges. She turned her back to me before I had even gathered my leather briefcase, addressing Maya in a loud, deliberate voice that echoed down the quiet glass house corridor. She said that she simply did not have time for nobodies today and instructed Maya to cancel the meeting immediately. Sli Frong, Thong. She added a sharp parting comment that if I actually mattered to the future of the company, I would never have been left waiting outside in the public seating area in the first place. Vice President Brandon Cole, standing just behind her, smirked in quiet approval. The entire floor fell into a dead silence. Junior analysts behind open-glass cubicles froze, pretending to study their screens while absorbing every word. I stood up smoothly, adjusted the buttons of my charcoal suit jacket, and picked up my briefcase. I looked Chloe straight in the eyes without a flicker of anger or irritation. I simply replied that her decision was understood. In business, especially when dealing with high-stakes corporate transformations, individuals like Chloe often confuse loud displays of status with actual structural leverage. She believed she had just performed a routine power move to establish dominance over an external vendor. She had no idea that by sunrise the next morning her decision would cost her company $500 million. I walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air of the financial district without looking back. That was the fundamental mistake executives like Chloe made when stepping into newly granted power. If I had walked through her doors with a team of 20 associates carrying printed pitch decks, wearing an internal corporate badge, she might have treated me with a baseline level of professional courtesy. But because I arrived alone, carrying a single leather folder without corporate branding, her superficial assessment led her to believe I was an expendable middleman. She failed to realize that capital does not flow merely because a company prints impressive financial projections on slide decks. At the institutional level, money follows trust, and trust resides exclusively with the individual who structured the agreement. When I returned home, later that evening, my wife, Diane Vance, was sitting in the study with her laptop open beside a stack of legal briefs. Diane is 52 years old, a seasoned corporate attorney who spent 25 years handling complex commercial transactions before stepping into private governance advisory work. She looked up from her desk the moment I set my briefcase down near the doorway. She noted the quiet calm in my posture and asked whether the closing review at Apex Pinnacle had gone as planned. I pulled out a chair across from her desk and explained that Chloe Montgomery had canceled the meeting in front of her entire executive staff. After leaving me in the lobby for over 40 minutes, declaring that she did not waste time on nobodies, Diane set her reading glasses down on the desk and leaned back, a quiet, knowing smile forming on her face. She remarked that inexperienced chief executives frequently mistake aggressiveness for competence, especially when inheriting a deal they did not build from the ground up. Diane pointed out that under the master syndicate structuring covenant we drafted 4 months ago, Apex Pinnacle had explicitly granted our independent advisory firm the sole fiduciary authority to coordinate communication between the 3 major institutional lenders. Under Delaware corporate law, specifically Title 8, Section 141, board-approved governance covenants cannot be unilaterally overridden by an executive officer without formal board ratification. The board of directors had pledged that all interactions regarding the $500 million funding facility would pass through our structured escrow mechanism to ensure transparency across all participating funds. Furthermore, Diane reminded me of the specific legal doctrines governing fiduciary obligations in joint venture capital raises. When an executive officer acts outside the scope of board authorizations to interfere with established third-party contracts, that officer creates immediate personal exposure under tortious interference doctrines. If Chloe's actions damaged the relationship with the syndicate funds, Apex Pinnacle's board would be forced to take corrective action to shield the company from shareholder derivative lawsuits. While Diane and I were discussing the legal framework over dinner, an entirely different scene was playing out inside the top floorboard room of Apex Pinnacle. Brandon Cole, the newly promoted vice president of corporate strategy, who was 42 years old and eager to secure his own position under Chloe's administration, was presenting a confidential strategy memo to Chloe. Brandon argued that keeping an external lead architect like Gavin Vance in the loop was an expensive redundancy. He claimed that now that the framework of the $500 million capital raise had been established, Apex Pinnacle's internal strategy team could bypass Vance completely and establish direct relationships with the institutional fund managers. Brandon insisted that cutting out external intermediaries would demonstrate operational strength to the financial market and save the company millions of dollars in structuring fees. Chloe, thrilled by the prospect of taking full personal credit for closing the $500 million financing package, endorsed Brandon's proposal on the spot. She authorized an internal memorandum instructing all corporate departments that Gavin Vance's advisory mandate was officially terminated and that all future communications regarding capital allocation would be handled directly through Brandon's strategy office. However, Chief Financial Officer Dean Ramsey, who was 51 years old and had managed Apex Pinnacle's balance sheet through 3 previous market cycles, immediately voiced strong resistance. Dean stood at the head of the conference table, gripping his tablet with visible tension. He warned Chloe and Brandon that the $500 million syndicate was not a single monolithic fund, but a delicately balanced co-investment agreement between 3 fiercely competitive institutions: Kingsley Financial Group, Price Asset Management, and Stonebridge Equity. Dean explained that Grant Kingsley, the managing partner of Kingsley Financial Group, had only agreed to act as the anchor investor on the explicit condition that Gavin Vance remained as the independent syndicate manager. Gavin was the neutral party who held escrow keys to the company's proprietary source code and oversaw the fulfillment of debt service coverage ratios. Dean stressed that removing Gavin without prior written consent from the fund principals was a direct breach of the preliminary master commitment letter. Dean reminded Chloe that institutional private equity firms operate under strict compliance mandates. When multiple funds co-invest $500 million into a growing tech enterprise, they do not rely on the borrower's promises. They rely on an independent syndicate manager to verify that covenants are maintained and that financial reporting remains untainted by internal corporate politics. Removing the independent manager wiped out the structural guarantee that held the entire deal together. Brandon dismissed Dean's warnings with a wave of his hand, arguing that institutional funds care only about yields and asset coverage, not about individual consultants. Chloe agreed with Brandon, stating that corporate business was about forward momentum and that she would not allow conservative financial officers to slow down her strategic timeline. Within 30 minutes of that internal meeting, Brandon Cole drafted and dispatched formal electronic notices to the executive offices of all three investment funds, informing them that Apex Pinnacle was assuming direct control of the syndicate coordination, and that Gavin Vance was no longer authorized to act on behalf of the transaction. The reaction from the institutional investment community was immediate, cold, and devastatingly quiet. At 5:15 that afternoon, Grant Kingsley was sitting in his corner office overlooking downtown Manhattan when Brandon Cole's memorandum arrived in his primary inbox. Grant is 58 years old, a veteran private equity leader who manages over $12 billion in institutional capital. He read the memorandum twice, his expression hardening with every line. Grant did not call Chloe Montgomery, nor did he instruct his associates to reach out to Brandon Cole. Instead, he placed a direct call to my private mobile line. When I answered, Grant asked me point-blank whether I had resigned from the syndicate architecture role, or if Apex Pinnacle had attempted a unilateral termination. I informed Grant calmly of the events that had transpired in the reception hallway earlier that day, including Chloe Montgomery's explicit statements regarding my status. Grant listened in complete silence before exhaling slowly. He stated that in 40 years of financial structuring, he had rarely witnessed a chief executive display such an alarming lack of governance discipline. Grant reminded me that Kingsley Financial Group had committed $200 million to the syndicate solely because my firm maintained independent verification of Apex Pinnacle's software patents and financial escrow under federal securities standards, specifically the Defend Trade Secrets Act under 18 U.S. Code, Section 1836. Without an independent fiduciary enforcing compliance covenants, placing $200 million into a company managed by an erratic chief executive presented an unacceptable fiduciary risk to his limited partners. Grant immediately instructed his general counsel to issue a formal notice of capital commitment suspension to Apex Pinnacle. Within 90 minutes, Nolan Price of Price Asset Management and Bradley Stone of Stonebridge Equity, having received Grant's notice and verified that I had been excluded from governance oversight, issued identical notices of immediate standstill. They cited a material breach of the syndicate structuring protocol and invoked their legal right to halt all wire preparations effective immediately. In major private banking networks, an automated risk flag is automatically triggered when lead syndicate members halt funding allocations. Commercial credit rating agencies monitor these compliance notices through central clearinghouses. Before midnight, Apex Pinnacle's primary commercial bank flagged the company's revolving credit facility for mandatory review. The bank's risk division sent an urgent inquiry to Dean Ramsey, requesting immediate confirmation that the $500 million equity facility remained valid. What Chloe believed was an internal scheduling adjustment had instantly triggered a systemic liquidity alarm across Wall Street. The financial market operates on subtle signals long before official announcements are made. When three major private equity firms simultaneously freeze communications regarding a debt and equity refinancing package, word spreads instantly across bank credit committees. By 7 o'clock that evening, senior underwriters handling Apex Pinnacle's existing credit lines began raising red flags regarding covenant compliance, preparing default notifications in the event that the $500 million closing failed to materialize. Back inside the executive suite of Apex Pinnacle, the central capital tracking display in the financial operating room began to update automatically. At 6:45 in the evening, Dean Ramsey walked into Chloe Montgomery's office without knocking. He placed his tablet directly onto her desk. On the screen, the primary capital line item showing $500 million in pending equity and debt commitments had turned from bright green to a flashing amber warning. STAP inactive pending governance review. Chloe looked up from her desk, her brow furrowing in irritation. She demanded to know why the tracking status had changed, asking if this was some temporary technical glitch in the system. Dean looked at her with an unblinking gaze and stated flatly that it was not a technical glitch. He informed her that Kingsley Financial Group, Price Asset Management, and Stonebridge Equity had all formally placed their commitments on hold. Every single dollar of the $500 million funding package was currently frozen. Brandon Cole, who was standing near the window, immediately stepped forward to offer a reassuring explanation. He insisted that this was merely a standard posturing maneuver by institutional funds, seeking to squeeze better yield terms at the final hour. He assured Chloe that once they realized Apex Pinnacle would not bend to pressure, they would return to the table before the morning deadline. But Dean turned to Brandon with sharp authority, telling him that institutional funds managing billions do not coordinate joint freezes as a bargaining tactic over minor yields. They do so only when they believe the leadership of the target company has lost structural stability. Dean pulled up a confidential memo from Grant Kingsley's legal team and read a key sentence aloud. Grant had explicitly stated that Kingsley Financial Group would not deploy capital into any entity where management demonstrates contempt for established governance structures. The message was unmistakable. Chloe had tried to assert dominance over an external nobody, and in doing so, she had convinced the largest institutional investor in her sector that she was unfit to manage their capital. By 7:30 the following morning, the morning sun had barely cleared the skyscrapers surrounding Apex Pinnacle headquarters when an unscheduled session of the board of directors was convened in the main ninth-floor boardroom. Harlan Cross, the 72-year-old chairman of the board and founding partner of the venture firm that originally backed Apex Pinnacle, sat at the head of the long glass table. Harlan was a man of few words, known throughout the industry for his uncompromising focus on corporate integrity and shareholder value. Chloe Montgomery sat to Harlan's right, attempting to maintain an aura of absolute composure. Brandon Cole sat behind her with a briefcase full of revised projections, prepared to present a narrative that attributed the funding delay to broader market volatility. However, Dean Ramsey opened the meeting by displaying the real-time Treasury ledger on the wall monitors. The display showed in stark detail that Apex Pinnacle had less than 45 days of operational liquidity remaining and that the senior credit facility maturity date was rapidly approaching, without the $500 million refinancing package in place. Harlan Cross leaned forward, his voice low and measured as he asked Chloe to explain precisely why three premier institutional funds had simultaneously issued notices of capital suspension less than 12 hours after she took office. Chloe began a prepared speech about streamlining corporate communication and eliminating unnecessary third-party advisory costs. But before she could finish her sentence, Harlan raised a hand to halt her speech. He turned to Maya Lawson, who had been summoned to the boardroom to present the official executive log. Harlan asked Maya to provide an accurate, first-hand account of the interactions that occurred in the reception hallway the previous afternoon between Chief Executive Officer Chloe Montgomery and Independent Syndicate Manager Gavin Vance. Maya glanced at Chloe with visible apprehension, but as an experienced corporate secretary, she understood the legal consequences of providing false information to a board of directors. She confirmed steadily that Gavin Vance had been left waiting for 42 minutes in the public lobby, and that Chloe had explicitly instructed her to cancel the meeting while stating in front of staff that she did not have time for nobodies. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Harlan Cross looked from Maya to Chloe, his expression unreadable. Dean Ramsey then presented a formal legal analysis prepared by external corporate counsel. The analysis confirmed that by unilaterally attempting to bypass Gavin Vance and terminate his governance oversight without board authorization, Chloe and Brandon had committed a clear breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law, specifically Title 8, Section 141, and triggered the automatic withdrawal clauses in the Master Syndicate Agreement. External counsel emphasized that under corporate law standards, executive officers who destroy vital institutional financing facilities through unauthorized deviations from board-approved contracts can be held personally liable for gross breach of fiduciary obligation. The board members exchanged grim looks. They realized that Chloe's desire to project personal status had brought the entire corporation to the brink of immediate financial insolvency. Harlan Cross closed the binder in front of him with a firm snap. He looked directly at Chloe and stated that her attempt to project personal power had jeopardized the very survival of the corporation. He made it clear that if $500 million in capital was not restored by the end of the day, the board would initiate an immediate leadership transition. Harlan ordered Chloe to contact Gavin Vance personally on speakerphone from the boardroom table and do whatever was necessary to repair the relationships and restore the syndicate. Chloe's face turned pale as she dialed my direct number. When I answered, her tone was completely transformed from the arrogant dismissal of the previous afternoon. She spoke in a breathless, carefully controlled voice, apologizing for what she termed a regretful misunderstanding in scheduling. She offered to immediately formalize my firm's role with double the original retainer fee, full authority over syndicate communications, and promised that Brandon Cole would be permanently removed from any involvement in capital management. I listened quietly as her voice echoed through the boardroom speakerphone. When she finished her proposal, I paused for several seconds before responding. I told Chloe evenly that this situation was never about retainers, titles, or scheduling errors. It was about fundamental trust and respect. She had chosen to use her new authority to humiliate an independent partner to project status. I informed her that I would agree to attend a meeting, but not a private one in her office. I stated that I would only present terms in person before the full board of directors and the institutional fund principals. At 11:30 that morning, I arrived back at Apex Pinnacle headquarters. This time, there was no waiting in the lobby. Maya Lawson was standing at the glass elevators to escort me directly to the ninth-floor executive boardroom. As I stepped through the double doors, the room was filled to capacity. Harlan Cross sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the entire board of directors. Chloe Montgomery sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together, while Brandon Cole sat in the far corner, avoiding eye contact with everyone. On the large high-definition video displays along the wall, Grant Kingsley, Nolan Price, and Bradley Stone were logged in via secure video conference. I walked to the podium at the end of the conference table, set my briefcase down, and looked across the room. Brandon Cole attempted to open the discussion by offering a smooth summary of restructured advisory fees, but Grant Kingsley immediately interrupted him from the video screen. Grant stated firmly that the institutional investors were not interested in hearing from internal strategy executives who had demonstrated a complete ignorance of corporate governance. Grant declared plainly that Kingsley Financial Group had committed $200 million to the deal specifically because of Gavin Vance's independent oversight, and that they had zero confidence in Chloe Montgomery's executive judgment. Harlan Cross took control of the meeting. He announced that after reviewing the events of the past 24 hours and evaluating the severe risk created by management's unauthorized actions, the board of directors had voted unanimously on two immediate executive resolutions. First, Brandon Cole was terminated from his position as Vice President of Corporate Strategy, effective immediately for gross negligence and breach of internal governance protocols. Security officers were instructed to escort Brandon from the building immediately following the meeting. Second, Chloe Montgomery was stripped of all authority over corporate development, capital allocation, and investor relations. Harlan explained that while Chloe would retain her title as Chief Executive Officer for routine internal operations during a transition period, her authority would be strictly confined under direct board supervision. All strategic capital decisions, corporate restructurings, and institutional relationships would henceforth be governed by an independent capital oversight committee chaired directly by Harlan Cross and advised by my firm. I then presented the restructured $500 million capital syndicate agreement to the board and the institutional investors. The terms remained identical to what we had crafted 6 months ago, with one critical addition: complete legal protection for Apex Pinnacle's intellectual property escrow, and mandatory independent auditing of all executive actions under Delaware corporate standards. Grant Kingsley, Nolan Price, and Bradley Stone each verbally confirmed their full commitment to the restructured terms. Authorized the immediate release of the $5 million funding package. As the formal board session concluded and directors began signing the finalized covenants, I packed my documents into my briefcase. Chloe Montgomery remained seated at the table, staring silently at the signed board resolutions. In less than 24 hours, her attempt to assert dominance over an external nobody had stripped her of the very authority she fought so hard to display. Her title remained on her office door, but the power behind it had vanished completely. I walked out of the boardroom and down the quiet glass corridor. As I waited for the elevator, I looked across the hall toward the executive corner office. Through the same flawless glass wall where I had watched her celebrating the day before, Chloe stood alone by the window, looking out over the financial district in silence. She turned slightly and met my gaze through the glass panel. I gave a polite, measured nod, stepped into the opening elevator doors, and watched the glass panels slide closed. My phone buzzed in my pocket as the elevator descended toward the ground floor. It was a text message notification from the primary escrow bank, confirming that the initial wire transfers for the $500 million syndicate had officially cleared. Less than 24 hours after being dismissed as a nobody in a corporate waiting room, the entire capital package was fully secured, completely intact, and executed strictly on our terms. In business as in life, respect is never an optional courtesy. It is the foundation upon which everything enduring is built.